There's this lift called the bent press, which you'll pretty much never see anyone doing anymore, but back in the day, this was considered one of the benchmark lifts, similar to how we think of the deadlift or the bench press today. If you go back 100 years or more, everybody was bent pressing, but no one was doing it quite like this guy. In 1905, Arthur Saxon bent pressed so much weight that 120 years later, no one has even come close to surpassing him. And that's especially strange when you consider how much bigger, stronger, and more advanced modern lifters have become. So in this video, we're going to do a deep dive into Arthur Saxon and his legendary bent press record. But before we do that, let's take a quick look at what a bent press actually is. Because if you're not into old school strongman, you might not have even heard of this lift before. As usual, the barbell would start on the floor. The lifter would pick up one end of the bar and stand it on its side. From here, he grabs the exact middle of the bar with his dominant hand and with a knee bend rocks it up to the shoulder position. Then comes the critical part of the lift. The lifter slowly bends and twists his torso down, getting lower and lower under the bar until his arm can be locked out straight. If you look at old footage of the bent press, you'll notice that the bar barely moves during this phase. That's because the lockout doesn't come from pressing the bar upward. It comes from mobility, balance, and the ability to get your head and torso deep underneath the weight. Once the arm is fully locked out, the lifter uses his legs and core to stand upright, while the locked out arm and shoulder simply stabilize the bar overhead. A bent press is a display of endurance, mobility, balance, and skill just as much as it is a display of strength. And with that in mind, let's talk about the record itself. Arthur Saxon is credited with the all-time bent press world record of 370 pounds, or 168 kilos. Now, before we go any further, I'm curious what your first impression of that number is. If you're a gym bro, you've probably moved that kind of weight before, deadlifting it, maybe squatting it. But what do you think about a natural lifter weighing about 200 pounds, getting that much weight off the floor and locking it out overhead with one arm? Drop a comment and let me know if you even think that's possible. And let's see if the rest of this video changes your mind. Arthur Saxon was born Arthur Hennig in Germany in 1878, the oldest of three brothers. He was notably strong even as a child and began weight training at a very young age. By 14, he had already tried to form his own little weightlifting club in a basement, which didn't last long before being shut down by the police due to noise complaints. That prompted him to move his weights into his apartment, which also ended in disaster when he failed an overhead lift involving one of his brothers sitting on top of a kettlebell. They came crashing down, putting a hole through the floor and even damaging the apartment below. At 16, Arthur finally joined a serious gym in his hometown of Leipzig, called the Atlas Club. There, he was surrounded by experienced weightlifters and wrestlers, an environment that quickly took his lifting to the next level. It was at the Atlas Club that Arthur caught the attention of a professional strongman named Arno Patschke, who was so impressed that he recruited Arthur and another lifter to form a strength act known as the Saxon Trio. The goal of the trio was to travel to Britain and challenge Eugene Sandow, who at the time was an untouchable, godlike figure in the strongman world. In 1898, shortly after arriving, they published an advertisement declaring, "Arthur Saxon hereby challenges Eugene Sandow, or any man in the world for any amount of money." On February 26th of that year, the Saxon Trio was performing at the Grand Theatre in Sheffield. At the end of the show, Arno announced, "For the final lift of the evening, Arthur will bent press a 264-pound barbell, a feat even the great Eugene Sandow cannot replicate." Unbeknownst to them, Sandow himself was sitting in the audience. Upon hearing his name, he rushed the stage to accept the challenge. Young Arthur made the lift on his second attempt. Sandow, however, had no such luck. After several tries, he did manage to get the weight overhead, but he failed to properly lock out the bar and the lift was ruled unsuccessful. The audience accepted Arthur as the winner, but the story was far from over. You see, Sandow's entire business was built on the claim that he was the strongest man in the world, a claim that allowed him to command enormous fees from theater owners. Arthur publicly defeated him, and calling himself the conqueror of Sandow was starting to hurt that business. A couple of years later, Sandow brought a lawsuit against Arthur. After lengthy litigation, the judge, who knew nothing about weightlifting, ruled in Sandow's favor. Arthur was forbidden from claiming to have defeated him, and he was also forced to pay Sandow a £25 fine. Perhaps the most perverse part of the trial was that Arno Patchke, the man who had originally recruited Arthur, testified on Sandow's behalf. He claimed the bent press challenge was unfair because Arthur's barbell was supposedly filled with mercury, which would slosh around and create instability. Now, despite the testimony or the verdict, everyone in the weightlifting and physical culture world knew it was a sham. It allowed Sandow to save face and continue selling his act as the best in the world. The trial also happened right before Sandow's great competition, a time when he certainly needed all the good publicity he could get. Arthur's reputation meanwhile remained intact among serious lifters, and he had no problem continuing to prove what he was capable of, as we'll see shortly. By the time the Sandow saga ended, Arthur had reformed the Saxon Trio, with his younger brothers Hermann and Kurt. While other performers came and went over the years, the three brothers together were by far the most successful, even touring America with the Ringling Brothers Circus. At a time when the line between real strength and circus trickery was paper thin, audiences were used to seeing fake lifts and gimmicks. The Saxon brothers stood out. They always invited spectators onto the stage to inspect and weigh their barbells, ensuring nothing was rigged. Arthur regularly issued open challenges, offering money to anyone who could beat him in his signature lifts. All of that brings us to the lift that ultimately cemented his legacy. On December 12th, 1905, 120 years before this video was uploaded, Arthur performed his famous 370-pound bent press. So how do we know? This is where Otley Coulter comes in, an American strongman from the same era who collected dozens of pages of newspaper clippings, magazine articles, and letters documenting the Saxons' feats. This entire collection has been scanned and made publicly available thanks to the fine folk at the University of Texas's Stark Center. I'll leave a link below so you can check it out yourself. There are far too many references to go through individually, but here are a few highlights. In a 1903 letter to Health and Strength magazine, Thomas Inch responded to a skeptic by stating that he personally weighed Arthur's barbell before and after performances and confirmed that Arthur bent pressed 300 pounds multiple times per day for his shows. He also noted that Arthur bent pressed 320 pounds in practice in his own gym, using Thomas Inch's bar, loaded and weighed by Thomas Inch himself. Even the legendary Scottish athlete Donald Dinnie was skeptical, until Arthur visited him. Dinnie didn't own a heavy enough barbell, so they strapped a 56-pound weight onto one end of a 230-pound bar. Arthur bent pressed the uneven 286-pound bar so easily that he didn't even bother removing his coat. From that day on, Dinnie became one of Arthur's strongest supporters, claiming no one in the world could match his one-handed lifts. But perhaps the most compelling clipping records George Hackenschmidt's opinion of Arthur, calling him a masterpiece, and stating that he would have never believed such lifts were possible had he not witnessed them himself. On that occasion, Hackenschmidt saw Arthur narrowly miss a 370-pound bent press, likely due to a strained shoulder after bent pressing 340 pounds twice previously. These are just the highlights. There are many more references in Coulter's scrapbook. From what I could gather, Arthur finally completed his personal best 370-pound bent press in Stuttgart, Germany. That makes first-hand accounts harder to track down beyond Arthur's own writing. In his book, The Development of Physical Power, he states that he performed the lift in the presence of several weightlifters and a representative of a major sporting paper. While I tried to locate the original German reporting without success, given Arthur's reputation and the sheer number of credible contemporary witnesses of his abilities, the lift starts to feel possible, even if the number itself sounds superhuman. While the bent press's popularity declined sharply after the Bronze Era, a few specialists in the Silver Era still achieved amazing numbers. Paul Beillargeon, I probably butchered that name, officially bent pressed 321 pounds in front of multiple judges in 1951. And according to David Willoughby, Al Bainert came the closest to Saxon's record with a 360-pound bent press in 1965. So if later lifters were getting into the same ballpark, why hasn't anyone surpassed Arthur Saxon? We have modern strongmen weighing 400 pounds, chemically enhanced, performing feats that seem almost unimaginable, yet a 200-pound natty set a record which no one can touch 120 years later? A big reason is simply how rare the bent press has become. There are no competitions, and no one is training for it seriously. But just as important is the level of mobility required. This isn't a lift you can brute force with explosive strength. The massive builds common in modern strongman are actually a disadvantage here. The only way this record gets challenged is if serious money gets put behind the bent press, or if another genetic outlier dedicates years to mastering this forgotten lift for whatever reason. So as much as I'd love to see the bent press make a comeback, I don't think it's happening anytime soon. For now, Arthur Saxon's record looks like it's set to stand indefinitely, and it's pretty safe to call him the greatest one-arm lifter who ever lived. I was about to end the video there, but you all know I can't resist a good biography, so let's rewind a little bit and quickly finish the Saxon story. The peak of their careers came during their American tour with the Ringling Brothers Circus. These were massive shows, and for several years the Saxon Trio was one of the main attractions. The problem, though, was their drinking and their unruly behavior. Yeah, these German lads were known for putting away absolutely ungodly amounts of beer, something the Ringling Brothers didn't particularly approve of. Eventually, it got bad enough that the trio was fired from the circus in 1913. That same year, they returned to England to keep performing, only to get interrupted once again by the outbreak of World War I. Being German in England suddenly became a liability. Public sentiment turned hostile, and opportunities dried up as audiences refused to pay to watch German performers. By 1914, the Saxons were pushed out of England and back to Germany, forcing Arthur to leave behind his English wife and the life he had built there. Kurt and Hermann were both drafted into the military, while Arthur avoided conscription due to being blind in one eye. While his brothers were away fighting, Arthur tried to continue performing on his own in Germany and Northern Europe, picking up work wherever he could. But making a living as a strongman during wartime was nearly impossible. Food was scarce, people were starving, and the kind of diet Arthur had relied on, especially large quantities of meat, simply weren't available. By the time the war ended, Arthur was 40 years old, malnourished and a shell of his former self. He made attempts to revive his career, but it just didn't work, and he very quickly faded into obscurity. Arthur Saxon died of tuberculosis in 1921 at just 43 years old, far removed from the life he had built with his wife in England. His death certificate lists his profession as a stonemason, a quietly brutal ending for one of the greatest lifters who ever lived.